Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, and we have as our regular co host is Jesse. Say hello to all of our tens of listeners, Jesse.
Hello there.
Fantastic. Moving on. if someone listening hasn't heard the podcast before, just a brief rundown. This is an angling podcast. It's all about fishing. And we try and keep it lighthearted and fun, but also share with you some tips and tricks that Jesse and I have discovered either on our own over fishing together for a couple decades, or having some amazing guests on and stuff like that, learning from actual professionals, sometimes in the podcast. Now, this topic today we're going to be talking about is all about the time of the year. It's fall, it's getting colder, and we're going to be doing kind of a general topic about shore fishing in Ontario, fall opportunities and tips. So that's going to be our main topic, but we are going to have an introduction first from Jesse, and I've heard he's prepared a TNT.
Yes, and if you didn't know, TNT stands for Techniques and Tips, or something like that. Is it Tips and Techniques, or I don't know, whatever. But it's basically a segment about tips and techniques, and it's usually explosive. So I thought, because I had a few people ask on social media, by the way, if you ever have any questions, feel free to send us a message on Instagram at Average Ontario Anglers. So I had a few people ask me about shore casting for salmon in the episode, and they're asking me how far to let their lure sink down. So I thought that we would talk a little bit about a technique that, salmon fishing by now, it's over. But this technique is great for all kinds of shore fishing as well as boat fishing, but it's a technique that we've been using for years, shore casting, and it's called the countdown method. Now, the countdown method is a great way to cover different depths of water, from shallow all the way to deep. So that being said, if you're stuck on the shore and you don't have a lot of access to a lot of water, like when you're in a boat, you can go fish here, you can fish there, you can move around. Sometimes when you're on the shore, you're stuck in one spot. You may be able to fan cast, a little bit this way, a little bit that way, but most of your different opportunities might just be in the depth. So the countdown method is a really effective technique to cover all of the water column and find where the fish are. Now, if you've never heard of this technique, it does not just involve using a countdown Rapala, although it's one of the best lures for this technique. So we're going to get into this. So Andrew and me have been doing the countdown method for a long time. And usually when we're doing this, we're fishing for salmon from shore or from a pier. So there's a local pier that we like to fish, and it's about 30 feet deep. Now, on any given day, unless you have x-ray vision, you probably don't know exactly where the fish are. You may have an idea of where they are in the water column. They may be just cruising under the surface, just like sharks. Sometimes you see that. But it might be a sunny day and they might be 20, 25 feet down near the bottom, or they might be right in the middle suspending. So you don't know where they are. So the countdown method usually involves using a spinning rod and reel. You can use a bait caster too, but we like to use a spinning rod and reel. And you're going to use a bunch of different lures. We're going to get into that. But basically the premise of this technique, it's pretty basic. You cast. When your lure hits the water, don't be a rookie and shut your bail, because that is just not going to let your lure have enough time to sink. And even if you let your lure sink on tight line, it'll pendulum towards you and it won't get depth. So keep your bail open and let that lure, whatever it is, a spoon, a crankbait, a countdown Rapala, let it sink down. And you're going to count in your head. 1, 2, 3. Try to keep it in seconds. And most of these lures are going to sink at a depth of 1 foot per second. I know the countdown Rapala, it basically says on the back that to count it down, it does go down 1 foot per second. It's not going to be 100% accurate. It's going to depend on a lot of factors like your fishing line, all that kind of stuff. But that gives you a basic idea. So the premise of this is you're going to start covering the water column. If you're fishing, deeper water, you might say, okay, I'm going to let it sink down 5 feet first. Make a few casts. If you don't catch anything, okay, I'm going to go down to 10 feet. You count it down to 10 feet. You make a few casts. You count it down to 15 and so forth. You go until you cover the whole water depth. And you will get to the point where eventually you're going to find where those fish are if the fish are hungry. And once you get to that moment when a fish grabs your lure, just make sure to remember exactly what the depth was. Maybe you counted down 17 feet. So you know that the fish are probably cruising down there, and then you can replicate. And that's the main thing about this technique, is to replicate your success from counting down a certain amount of time. Because unfortunately, when you're a shore angler, you don't usually have a fish finder. You can have those little castable ones, but generally you don't have all the electronics to see where the fish are. So this is kind of like doing it DIY style. But the cool thing is, the fish finding device is actually a lure, and then you catch them. So that's pretty awesome, right, Andrew?
Absolutely.
So some of the best lures for this, like we mentioned, we do a lot of shore casting for salmon. A spoon is great. This is just a Len Thompson #2. This technique works for all different species, not just salmon. You can use it for walleye, you can use it for pike, anything. So a spoon, a little Cleo, a Len Thompson, a moonshine, anything like that, you cast it out and it will flutter down and you count it down. Now, I don't know exactly how fast these things sink. It might be about a second, but it gives you a general guideline of how much they sink. So that's one great lure, is a spoon in general. You can use your favorite spoon, your favorite spinner. Another great lure, it's kind of an underrated lure, is a lipless crankbait. Now, we've been using these for salmon for a long time. I actually was just talking to a guy who caught a really nice salmon from listening to our last year's podcast about shore casting for salmon and using a lipless crankbait. And it was a lure that he hadn't used before for salmon, and he actually caught a nice salmon on it. So it does definitely work. We've been using them for a while. One reason that they are really effective for salmon is because they're really annoying. You can get them in fire tiger color. This one here is just like a sexy shad color, like a bait fish color. But listen how annoying these are. This is why salmon hate them. They rattle like crazy. Actually, a lot of people call them rattle baits, right? But a lipless crankbait is awesome because you can cast them. They cast really far and they sink about a foot per second. And then when you reel them in, they have a really tight wobble and they throw off all kinds of flash, vibration, and lots of rattle. So they annoy fish and they call fish in from a distance. So that's another great lure. Some of my favorite rattle baits has always been the cotton cordell super spot because they're inexpensive. They catch fish. If you are fishing for salmon though, I would recommend upgrading the hooks because they're pretty thin, like bass hooks. Another one of my favorite ones is the Rapala. What's that fat one called? The Rip and Wrap? The Rip and Wrap. It's like the fatter one, and that thing sinks really deep and casts really far. What are some of your favorite rattle baits, Andrew? I know Andrew's a big rattle bait guy.
I really like the Rattlin' Wrap, like the original Rapala lipless crank.
Oh yeah.
Another one is the Rattle Trap, which was, I think, one of the original of the lipless cranks, ever put out on market. But you can still find those around, and they come in a big variety of sizes. You can get them almost to like a musky size, like big ones.
Don't you have one of those big ones?
I do have a big musky size one.
Yeah. So again, like you said, this technique is not just for salmon. You can use a lipless crankbait, fish for any species from panfish all the way up to muskie, and you count it down. Actually, I just found that Rapala when I was talking about the Rip and Wrap. If you're watching this on YouTube, that is one of my favorite lipless baits. You can also use the smaller sizes for ice fishing, which is really cool. And the one bait that
Wrap was another good one, but they don't sell that anymore. The Clacken Wrap.
Oh, the Clacken Wrap.
Big ball bearing in it. Yeah, in a metal drum.
Yeah, it's funny. Like some of these like lures that they're awesome, and they go to, like, no one buys them anymore, and they just stop making them. It's like, no, my favorite. And then the last lure that I'd recommend if you're doing this technique. So basically, so far, to summarize, we have a spoon, a lipless crankbait, and it's another crankbait, and I mentioned it before, is the Countdown Rapala. These baits are so underrated. Lots of people use them, but they're not really talked about a lot. So if you're just getting into fishing, it might not be something that you think of getting originally. But it is a minnow style bait. You can get them in all different sizes, all the way from, I think Andrew has one that's literally the size of like a peanut. Like half a peanut, I'm saying. Like tiny little panfish size, all the way up to, I think,
has
like
one treble hook, one
tiny,
super thin wire treble hook on the back. That's it.
It looks like just like a bean with a hook on it.
Yeah, it does.
But you can use baits from that size all the way up to, I think the biggest Countdown, I know they have like saltwater ones and stuff, but the regular bass ones I think is like 4.5 inches long. This particular one is about 3 inches long, perch color, great walleye bait. I've caught trout on these, brown trout, sheephead, anything hits these things. They're great because they're so versatile. They have just a tight wobble. It's not erratic and crazy. And in the fall, oftentimes you want something that has more of a tighter, more natural action, because the minnows are slowing down too because it's cold. They're not just swimming around crazy like in the summer. So that's another cool bait. So it's a technique that probably a lot of you have used before. But if you are fishing from shore for the first time, and it's one of those things where you can just get out after work and maybe you're used to fishing in your boat, but it's fall now, you put your boat away and you're like, I want to fish from shore. What kind of bait should I bring? These are some of the baits you should bring. They're versatile. And if you use the countdown method, you can cover a lot of the water column and find where those fish are and get some fish into the net. So that's a great technique to try if you haven't tried it. And if you do try it and it works out for you, again, let us know. Send us a picture on Instagram. We love seeing the pictures of the fish.
Mm-hmm.
Back to Andrew.
I really like that tip, Jesse. That's a good tip. And something else, just about the sink rate of different lures. Don't be too concerned about, it doesn't sink exactly a foot. Like if you want to cover the spread, count it down 5 seconds. And that means that it sank down 3 feet. You're covering 3 feet lower. And then you go another 5 seconds more, 5 seconds more. Some baits may sink faster, and that's 7 feet lower. You're still covering the spread of the water column. So don't be too, picky with yourself if you're not aware exactly how fast the lure sinks. Still just slowly increase that time every cast, and it's going to be covering the depth. So just a little thing. Don't be too concerned if it's not the exact countdown and it's exactly 1 foot a second. That's a general rule of thumb.
You don't have to bring graphing paper and do the vectors of the lure velocity and I don't even know science, but you don't have to do that.
You have to add your line. Are you using braid or fluorocarbon? Because one floats, one sinks. Or is it sinking braid? Or using lead core? Who's using lead core for shore casting? I don't know.
What's the temperature of the water? Where's the position of Jupiter? You don't have to worry about that. Shore casting is easy. It's supposed to be enjoyable. It's a great technique to catch fish. So it doesn't have to be complicated.
Excellent. And another thing you mentioned there is talking about fall fishing. So that's the main topic of the episode. Why is fall fishing great to do from shore? There's a few things I can think of. There's a lot less boat traffic. Fish. There's some may argue this point, but there's a lot of instances where certain fish, they move in closer to shore. Some people may think, the water's getting colder, they're not leaving the shallows. We're not talking about shore fishing in 2 feet of water for largemouth bass from shore. That's not going to be your fall fishing technique.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of species that they may usually be way out in the middle of the lake, but because the water's getting colder, they're coming into shore to where it is castable range. Another thing you got to think about, though, that is colder weather. So we're going to get into a little bit as well as to how we as humans, as an angler, can prepare for it. But our first segment, we're going to go over some different species that we'd recommend targeting for the fall for shore fishing. If that's what perhaps you've done before, you can kind of check off the list and see what ones you've already covered, what ones maybe you still want to reach, or maybe you've never done fall shore fishing. These will give you some ideas. I'd have to say my favorite one to target. I love pike fishing.
Yep.
And in the fall, when the pike are coming back in, especially into areas of current and whatnot, it can be an awesome location because they're going to be even in the fall, fish are getting ready for the spawn in the spring still. So that's what a lot of the movement is based on, water temperatures, but they're coming in. And pike, they'll spawn under the ice before it even breaks up sometimes. So you can find them coming in closer to their spawning areas, close to those inshore, shallower bays around river mouths and whatnot. What are some of your favorite fish to target in the fall, Jesse?
I think around me, where I grew up anyway, one of the most popular fish to catch, I'd say in the fall throughout the winter, was steelhead or rainbow trout. And, the salmon run's pretty much done. I mean, you can get stragglers that come in throughout, late fall. But generally, you have to think salmon run is pretty much in summer. It's late summer. They come up in August. It's still summer. And then it's still summer until the end of September. And by then, the salmon run's starting to die down. So it's pretty much summer. Yeah. And then in fall, it's you get the zombies. It's just all the rotted, dead salmon. So not really that appealing to chase. It depends on the year. I mean, we've caught some salmon in December sometimes when we're float fishing for steelhead. So you never know. But yeah, it's definitely steelhead. It's the time of year that, there's not a lot of things to fish for, if that makes sense, especially if you don't own a boat. There's guys going out still in, November, December, and they're fishing for, muskie, or they're fishing for other things out in their boats. But if your boat's already away, if you have a small boat, you probably don't feel comfortable going out on a big lake in cold water. Especially the weather in the fall is usually sketchy,
Yeah.
So especially for me, I pretty much put my boat away at the end of October. like my canoe. If I had a bigger boat, I would go right into December myself. But for me, not worth falling in and freezing to death. So I generally, after that, it's just shore fishing for me until ice fishing starts, which is not really shore fishing, but it kind of is. Like, I don't know what it classifies as, because the shore, like the lake freezes and you walk from the shore onto the lake, which is technically still not the
It's
shore.
hard
but
water fishing.
yeah, it's cool, but similar to shore fishing because you just walk. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, steelhead fishing is great. So you still have that time when there's not really anything to do before ice fishing season, and you get these beautiful fish that come up from the lake into the cold water, and these fish love the cold water. They love it. They come up and they're going up the creeks. They're a bit hard to catch that time of year. You have to kind of have a little bit of know-how. We're going to talk a bit about it, but it is so rewarding to catch a fall dime silver steelhead. It's amazing. They're beautiful fish.
Yeah, and another one that Jesse said that we are targeting a lot in the fall these past few years is muskie. A lot of the muskie guys, they can't wait till fall. That's prime muskie season. What happens is a lot of these muskie, they come in shallower. The big muskie. Yes, there's going to be some muskie that bite off your frog when you are flipping for bass in the summer, in the shallows. But in the fall, that's when those 40 pluses, they come into those areas. They come into the shallower water. You can actually reach them. Maybe it's not, the surface cover weeds, but it may be some of those, weed lines just offshore, still within 30 feet, let's say, from shore. So you can still cast to those areas and target them. Again, a lot of these fish, like even for the salmon run, like we talked about before, most of the year they're inaccessible to shore anglers. So unless you have a boat, and especially for something like steelhead, unless you have a big boat to go on the like Lake Ontario or Lake Huron or like places like the Great Lakes, these huge bodies of water, you're not going to be able to effectively target these fish when they are out in those deeper areas. So now, again, they're coming to us. Let's take advantage of it. So we're going to talk about a few different areas for shore casting, as to where if you don't know where to go in your local area. Again, we're not going to be handing out, hey, this is where I shore cast during this time of year for this species of fish. Here's my GPS coordinates. Instead, because we recognize that our listeners don't live within 20 minutes of where we live, a lot of our listeners are in either other parts of the world, other parts of Canada, other parts of Ontario. Ontario is absolutely massive for those who aren't aware. So for us to give you locations is not going to be very helpful to the majority of our listeners. But if we talked about kind of geographical locations as to what to look for, something like I already talked about with the pike, rivers and creeks, those are areas where if there's trout in the area, if there are steelhead or rainbows, they're going there to spawn. They're going there to start their winter run. They're staging for it. They absolutely 100% need a inflowing body of water, like a river or a creek. You're not going to find a dead-end bay and be like, yes, there's rainbows in here. Like, the odd straggler might come in, but they don't spawn in that area.
Yeah.
So that's the big one for me, is anytime I can find river mouths and creeks, even like on the river itself, once those fish come in, they can be absolutely hot spots.
And just to add to the rivers and creeks, so we're kind of talking about, trout, northern pike, and a little bit of muskie. But for rivers and creeks, a lot of people have asked me over the years, like, what creeks have trout in them? In Ontario, anyway, like, we live on the north shore of Lake Ontario, so there are, a few, like a dozen or so creeks that get good runs of fish in them. So not every creek that runs into Lake Ontario has a good run of steelhead in it. It's easy to find out that information. A little bit of research on Google will help you find if the creeks near you have steelhead in them. One easy way is to drive past the creek access on a weekend and see if there's cars parked there. That probably means that there's steelhead because there's guys fishing, but it's pretty easy to find out. Not every creek has a good run of steelhead in them. Another thing you have to do too is, if you're doing your research, make sure you look up the regulations, because they're always changing. There are different areas of the creek that you cannot fish during the fall. There's boundaries that you can't cross. There's certain times of the year that you can't fish above certain areas. Some of the creeks now, there is limited access to some of the parts. So you don't want to just be like, okay, this creek has trout in it. That's great. I can fish wherever I want in the creek. No, there's specific rules for fishing in the fall. They're not terribly crazy rules, so they're pretty easy to find. There's no excuse to be fishing out of bounds. So it's easy information to find. And if all is lost, like if you have no idea and you just don't know how to use Google for whatever reason, go into your local tackle shop. They will be happy to tell you. Like I worked in a tackle shop. Guys would ask me, they'd come in and be like, hey, where can I catch a rainbow trout? And I'd tell them, I'd be like, oh, down the road, there's a creek here, or drive, 20 minutes down there, there's a creek there. And, you'd tell them, like, you can fish from here down. I'm not going to tell them spots. They can find them themselves, but you tell them the creeks. Like tackle shops, local tackle shops are great. They don't just sell gear, but they'll give you expert advice. And usually, sometimes if you're a good customer and you buy a lot of stuff, they'll often tell you good spots as well, not just creeks. So keep that in mind too. But make sure you look into the rules because especially with trout fishing, there are a lot of rules to it.
Absolutely. Another thing is shore fishing on lakes. Something I did a lot on the East Coast when I was, I've been out there a couple times just for visiting family and whatnot. And a lot of the time when I go fishing out there, I don't have access to a boat at all. I don't drag mine out 18,000 kilometers to the East Coast.
18,000?
1,800 kilometers.
Okay.
1,800. Okay. It's a lot. I mean, I get an oil change halfway through the trip.
Yeah.
But over there, there's a lot of like good accessible shorelines where there's no dock, there's no nothing, but you can just walk along the shore of the bank and just start casting it from shore. We're catching lots of chain pickerel in the early spring or in the fall when I've been out there. Smallmouth bass are out there. But even here in Ontario or any other part in the world that you are, if there are accessible shorelines, and by that I mean places where it's not trespassing to be beside the lake. There are a lot of lakes in Ontario. A lot of them may have private property surrounding the whole thing. And it's essentially now a private lake because it's all privately owned cottages or homes surrounding that body of water. We are not endorsing people to start walking through backyards and start casting off of people's docks and stuff like that in the back.
But if you want to do it legally,
nice as it looks.
If you want to do it legally though, get a parachute, a friend with an airplane, and a raft, and go to town. And then when you want to get out, if you've ever seen Batman, remember when he has like the suit with the balloon that shoots in the air and the plane with the skyhook catches him and pulls him out of the lake, you'd have to do that. So these lakes may not be worth the expense to get into, but if you have lots of money, I recommend trying that. Let us know how it goes.
If you aren't insane like that, or like Jesse, then another option is a lot of these lakes, they will have a public park surrounding the side. And unless there's no bylaws, sometimes there are bylaws in place. If it's a very populated area, they may say no fishing just for the safety of other pedestrians around. But oftentimes there's public parks and you can cast right from the shore there. They'll have, maybe 1,000 feet of shoreline you can walk along and cast. And again, you may not be looking at the direct shoreline like, oh, it looks pretty dead, but see if you can, even look on Google Maps, see if there's a weed bed that grows out further on, or if you have access to Navionics, like the app, you can see if there may be a weed line that is further out within casting distance from those areas, because that's where the fish are going to be. They're not going to be against the shoreline. So if it looks kind of dead directly against shore, who cares? You're worried about where the fish are, which is a bit further out.
So I think, like you mentioned, we've mentioned this in the past 2 episodes about Navionics. Now I know it's expensive, definitely is, but if you only shorecast and you're looking for lake access, it's very easy to waste your time. To drive all the way somewhere, you're like, this spot looks good, and you get there and it's crap. So if you have Navionics, at least you can look ahead, do a little research, and be like, all right, I'm going to fish near this bridge, which is another great spot to fish. A lot of these, rivers or lakes where next down there's a bridge. You oftentimes see people underneath bridges fishing. Sometimes you see a troll, but sometimes it's just an angler who's been there a few days. But they're popular spots for a reason. These neck down spots with a bridge, they have some shade. They're usually a bit deeper when they dig it out for the bridge, so it has some depth to it usually. So they're great spots to fish. But if you have Navionics, you could go around and be like, all right, I'm in this area. I'm going to fish this spot, fish it for a bit, and then I'm going to drive up to this spot because it looks like it's deep water. It's not super shallow. Like Andrew said, you're not going to be fishing in 2-3 feet of water. You want some depth, some steep drop off, stuff like that. With Navionics, you can look ahead and be like, hey, these spots look good. I'm not going to waste my time. I can actually put in my time and hopefully be successful, not waste it, you know? So navionics, huge. Going into a little bit about spots on a lake. Bridges are great. Always try under a bridge. So many times, you know, you're a true angler. When you're driving somewhere and you drive over a bridge, what do? Every single time.
You crane your neck over the guardrail.
You crane your neck, you look and you go, I want to fish that. Unless it's crap, then you keep driving. But there's a reason for that. Anglers are attracted to bridges. It's like they love bridges. It's like a weird thing, you know? I should get a shirt that just says I love bridges. It's kind of weird. But anyway, bridges are great. They're great spots.
Jeff Bridges.
Yeah. I've caught some pretty good fish under bridges. I've caught muskie under bridges, bass, lots of carp. I've spent many an hours sitting under a bridge carp fishing over the years, which is another great species to go shore casting for. Another spot on a lake that is kind of a given is piers. So like if you're fishing for a lot of species, but even a lot of the Kawartha lakes around us, there's little piers or jetties going out into the lake, and it gives you instant deep water access. So it may be shallow, you know, as far as you can cast. But when you're on a pier, you get out 100 feet, all of a sudden you're in, you know, 12, 15 feet of water. And it's great. All of a sudden you have all this access to this deeper water. And it's a pier. So it's a big piece of structure in the water that attracts fish close to it. So again, bridges, piers, jetties, and then riprap too, which is just like when they dump big boulders and rocks around the edge of the river to stop erosion. So check out that as well, because that's going to hold heat too. So like rocks, bridges, piers, concrete holds heat in. And these fish, they like cold water, but they like to have a little bit of heat too. They don't like being too cold. So if you look for things like this, these are places that will attract fish and you'll catch more fish. Again, you don't want to just walk down to a lake and just start casting willy-nilly in the middle of deep water. You probably won't catch anything. So you have to have a little bit of strategy.
And even if those areas aren't perhaps what you might think of as what the game fish you're going, like trout are not looking for the warmest water right there, but they're still feeding, and all the minnows and stuff that they're going to be feeding on, you'll often see in the fall, you look off the side of that pier or on a concrete ledge and you'll see the schools of minnows coming right along that edge. And it maybe just because it's a little bit warmer, more comfortable for them there. These other game fish species, they're there for the food. That's where the food is. So even if you're like, oh, muskie, what's a muskie going to want with a little bit cold, you know, warmer water against a flat rock edge? Well, he wants the food that's also there.
Yes. Again, like Bobby said last week in the podcast, to find the game fish, you have to follow the bait fish. So if you can find those bait fish, you'll find the game fish. Catching them, that's a different matter. Who knows?
We don't have any advice on that.
I don't. Listen to last week's podcast. I'm just kidding.
Another pro tip I want to mention about fishing piers. I grew up fishing the Beaverton Pier just because I live outside of Beaverton. And oftentimes what I see most people do on piers is they go right to the very end and they start casting off the end into the lake. It's like that can work. Sometimes that's very effective. But I can say this is a little tip. Now, this is not a hot spot because it's not like it was ever amazing fishing. But on the Beaverton Pier, I found far more success fishing in the channel rather than at the end of the pier. And again, you still have access to deep water. It's still, you know, dug out. Boats are coming in and out. But in the fall, there's a lot less boat traffic. And so when you're fishing in the channel, you're not in the way of boats coming through. I'm not saying have a giant line out with a bobber hanging out, but like just cast and retrieve style baits or fishing, you know, closer to the edge you're on. It was more sheltered. The warmer water, sometimes from the river mouth coming in, it would hold a bit warmer right there before it emptied out into the main lake. So there's some benefits sometimes to fishing, not, you know, at the furthest out possible thing you can. If you're on a pier or a big break line on you know, by a harbor or something like that, a major harbor, don't be concerned about fishing more to the inside of it. Sometimes that has a lot of holding power for fish. Just a little tip. But what about gear? What do you think for gear for the fall, Jesse?
Oh, I was gonna mention a few more spots before we move on, if you don't mind.
I didn't want to give everyone all the, you know, they had to figure out some things, but okay, we'll carry on.
Andrew just doesn't want me to tell you his secret spots. But I was thinking, so we talked about rivers and creeks, which, I mean, they're easy enough to find. You can find them on any map. It's not like they're like camouflaged under a jungle, you know. They're there. You see them. You drive over the bridges, right? Local lakes with accessible shorelines. Again, no diving in off of a helicopter. Don't do that. But urban fishing spots. So I think a lot of people, when they think of fishing, they think of like, oh, spending time in the great outdoors out in the wilderness. Not the case. So like we live in Ontario. We live in the GTA, which has 10 million people in it in a small area. In like 100 square kilometers, there's 10 million people. So it's very urban, obviously a big city, but there's a lot of urban fishing opportunities. So we're not going to, again, there's tons of spots. You can find them. We're not going to say spots, but there's lots of local marinas, harbors. There's parks, like Andrew said, along some of these areas. But we've had really good success fishing for pike, fishing for bass, fishing for a lot of different species. Pike really comes to mind, especially in Lake Ontario. There's some giant pike in there in some of the local marinas. And there's spots that if you go there in the summer, they kind of look meh. But when the water cools down, these fish come in. They come in to feed on bait fish that are coming in these areas. So don't shy away from fishing in the city. It may feel weird. You see these guys holding big pike and the CN Tower's right behind them. There's big pike in there. Like, don't worry. If you live in the city, no problem. You can still catch giant fish. Actually, I'd say you probably have a better chance catching a giant pike down in Toronto area than you do in half the lakes in like the Kawarthas. There's giants in there, so don't worry.
I would
all the pike guys in Toronto are mad at me now for saying that, but yeah, there's big fish there. And
but
one more
if
thing,
you want to go further away, then is that what you're getting into? If you want to be more in the wilderness next,
yeah,
then you could talk about provincial parks, conservation areas. The cool thing with places like that is in the summer they're full of campers, right? If you think of like a car campground, something like that, where you're going to have a lot of access, and they'll shut down the comfort stations in the colder temperatures. And so a lot of the camping drops off. So these parks often are empty. Sometimes they're completely closed for the winter. But a lot of people you can still get access in because it's still allow people for just day trips or whatnot. And these parks often around either small lakes or against the shores of larger lakes. And you can have a lot of useful shoreline from there where you're not going to have a lot of, you're not going to be downtown in the city. You're going to be a bit more secluded. You're not going to be surrounded by people the whole time. Beautiful areas. And you can have some awesome experiences there because, again, these fish, they're coming closer to shore. And also with less activity against shore, certain fish may even, who perhaps aren't always found in that area, may start to habitat those areas, like the main boat launches certain areas. Maybe it's too busy for them to hang out there, but in the fall, no one's launching boats. They're all out of the water, and fish are like, this is great sanctuary for us.
Yeah.
So things like that, keep in mind for, if it's normally busier and it's slowing down, there's fish in that body of water. The fall is an amazing time to target those areas because they're just less busy with humans.
True. But make sure some provincial parks literally do close and you do not get access. So there are a lot of provincial parks that are open year round and have good fishing. So make sure you do a little planning. Just don't show up at like your favorite provincial park and they're like, yeah, we closed on Thanksgiving. You're like, it's November. I just wasted 2 hours of driving. So call ahead. But there are a lot that are open year round. So definitely try that. So we've kind of covered a lot of different areas that you could pick. Like, honestly, if you had to like get a pen and paper and write just in your head or on the paper a bunch of spots that you wanted to fish, you probably already have a bunch of spots in your head that you're like, you know what, I could probably try this spot, this spot, this spot. And they may be spots you've never tried before. I think the greatest thing about shore fishing is, we're going to kind of get into gear in a second, but it's so minimalist sometimes. Like, me and Andrew just went camping and you bring so much stuff. You have to bring this, the tackle boxes, the rods, a fish finder, all this stuff, gas, all this stuff that you don't even have for the stuff you use, but you need all this stuff. But when you go shore casting, it's like you can grab one rod, a backpack with a tackle box in it, and a thermos of coffee and a sandwich. And you walk out there and you can fish for like an hour. You can fish for half an hour on your lunch break, or you can fish for like 6 or 8 hours if you want. But it's so minimalist. And I think that's what the great thing is, because it doesn't require a lot of expense. You could literally not own a car. You could take a bus and get down to some of these spots, or you could walk and just bring the most basic gear and a backpack and be ready to go. So that's a great thing about shore fishing. It doesn't require you to be some rich guy with a bass boat and all this stuff. No.
And I would recommend to reevaluate, look at a map again and see what's around your area. There may be certain things that you can only fish certain times of year where they're going to be effective. And yeah, it may not be something you do all the time, but hey, you know what? For those couple months or a month in the fall, I'm going to target that area because all signs are pointing to I should have success there. I can have success there. And hey, why not make use of something that's 5 minutes down the road from your house that's effective for that month? Go there that month. Do it.
Yeah.
So reevaluate. Look at what's around you again, because throughout the seasons, things are changing. We talked about that with Bobby. Throughout the seasons, throughout the weeks, throughout the days, things change. But the seasonal changes are going to be like the biggest changes in where fish are located in a lake or in any body of water.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get into some of our gear now. So for a rod and reel, we're going to give a couple suggestions, but it again, it depends on what you're looking to cast with, or what you're planning to cast. As for lures, again, you're not going to be using a medium action spinning rod to toss a big musky bait for the fall because you just won't be able to do it unless you want to try and claim warranty on something that's absolutely your fault for breaking in half.
It's like reason for breakage or like 10-ounce lure on an ultralight.
Monster bulldog on on my Claris.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I would recommend, if I think of shore casting for just general purpose, again, I know a lot of our listeners, you may not have a bunch of purpose-built rods. If you do, that's great. And if you have a bunch of purpose-built ones, you probably already have an idea of what you want to use. But for a general purpose, if I'm casting from shore, I like to use a medium-heavy spinning rod for most things. I love a medium action spinning rod I'm in the boat, but if I'm casting from shore, I like to go like a half strength up. And that's my personal preference. But again, I'd like to have a little bit more power or control over whatever I'm fishing in the area that I'm fishing, because again, there's going to be green weeds still out there. And if I don't have a boat to go retrieve my bait, or I'm not fishing, reeling in a fish where I can pull it into open water, I'm going to be pulling it into more debris. I like to have a bit stronger rod for that. What do you think, Jesse?
Well, like you said, it depends what you're fishing for, right? Like if you're like drop shotting for smallmouth bass,
yeah,
then you're probably going to use a medium light rod. But I just thought we could talk maybe about the two species that we're mainly focused on is pike and trout. So for pike, which is like, I think that's the rod kind of you were thinking of with pike, is like a medium heavy spinning rod, and that's a great choice because I think Andrew's 100% right with that. A medium can do a lot of stuff. It's a very versatile rod, medium power. But a medium heavy, if you hold them side by side, it's not that much more heavy. It's just like a touch heavier. It's like just a wee bit more power. That's it. It's still sensitive. It's still light, but you just got a little bit extra power, especially when you're pike fishing. If you're chucking slightly bigger baits, a medium just won't cut it. And especially if you're fishing and you're only going to get 1 or 2 bites a day, you want to get a good hook set. You want to get those hooks into the fish's mouth. The extra slightly heavier rod is it's going to be a little better for you. But if you have a medium, that's fine. Don't worry. A medium is a great rod. It does everything. It's a universal do-it-all rod. For pike fishing myself, I would say very similar to that is a medium heavy spinning rod. I've also, a lot of times I would just use my salmon casting rod, which is an 8.6 medium heavy. So it's basically the same rod. It's just, an extra foot longer. So it gives you a little bit more casting distance. But one rod that I've really been loving for pike fishing, because I started using slightly bigger baits. I know we're going to get into baits, but when you're starting to chuck baits, like this is a Rapala jerk bait. It weighs like 1/2 ounce. So you can chuck that on a medium power rod. But when you start chucking baits like this, like a 7-inch swim bait, you can't chuck that on a medium anymore. You're going to have to go up to a much heavier rod. Even a medium heavy spinning rod, not going to handle that. So one rod that I started using is a swim bait rod. Now, again, it's a more specific rod. And if you're listening to this and you just want to have one rod, don't buy this rod. But this is a cool rod and I want to talk about it. So a swim bait rod, they come in different powers. So Andrew has a medium heavy swim bait rod. Don't confuse that as being similar to a medium heavy bass rating. A medium heavy swim bait rating is very different. So medium heavy bass casting rod is usually rated from 1/4 ounce to 3/4 ounce. A medium heavy swim bait rod is usually rated from 1 ounce to 4 ounces or something like that. So it's a much beefier rod. It's more like the in-between rating of a bass rod and a musky rod. So it's like the swim bait rating. So I ended up picking up a swim bait rod that can cast baits up to about 6 ounces. And for me, when I'm pike fishing in the fall, we oftentimes use big swim baits like this because, those big fish, they're big fish. They like eating big things. They're fattening up for the winter. And as you can tell, like we have some of these baits. These are Shadzilla Juniors from Waterwolf Lures. You can tell this one, it's got chewed many times. It has many fish on it. I'm almost retiring this one or two more fish. And these baits weigh about 3 ounces. So you need something a little heavier, something like, a mag draft, something like that, where you can just cast it all day. I'm not saying you need specific swim bait rods for these. You could cast this on a 7.5-foot flipping stick. That's another great option. But if you're looking for a pike rod, it's really hard to beat a swim bait rod or a flipping stick, something a little heavier. You can still whip a lure pretty far. You can still cast a big spoon on it. It's a versatile rod. And then when you do hook a big pike, you can get the hooks right into them. So that would be my pick for pike. But if I had to go, I'm rambling because I like gear. We have lots of different combos we picked up over the years. So if you're more of in the gear, nerd style, that's the rod I would pick. But if I had to pick one rod overall, it would probably be the same as Andrew, a 7 to 7.5-foot medium heavy spinning rod. And I'd load that with 20-pound braid, 30-pound braid. And then I'd put obviously some kind of a fluorocarbon leader for pike because they will bite right through braid like scissors. So yeah.
Absolutely. And even with like a heavier action rod, like you said, that swim bait rod, for example, I love casting that. Like Jesse said, it's a medium heavy swim bait rod from my bait caster that I have. And I can use that to still cast, jerk baits, like a regular standard size jerk bait. It may not load maybe as well, but again, I have no issue casting those baits still. So I think mine is rated for 3/4 to 3 ounce or 3.5 ounces, something like that.
Yeah.
So I can still cast, but you can still cast stuff that's a 1/2 ounce on it. It may not load as well. You can still cast it. Make sure your drag's a little bit lighter when you're using a heavier rod like that, just with this thinner hooks. But again, it can be another do-it-all rod for just larger fish. So it's a good option for you if you don't have a wide selection to choose from.
Yeah.
Now, some of the lures that we were going to talk about, you mentioned jerk baits. They're fantastic. One of my favorite things to fish for in the fall, or fish with in the fall, is spinners. And I don't use them a lot in general. I used to use spinners like year round, all the time. I'm throwing a Mepps Aglia like all the time.
Yeah.
Because it works. It works really, really well. But if in the fall I find it's one of those baits where I have ultimate confidence in it. And again, like you said, in the fall, I may have some times where fishing may be a bit slower than what you experience. Sometimes you're going to be on a hot bite and it's going to be the best fishing you'll ever experience. But I have confidence with this spinner that anything will bite it that's in that area, and it just works. And I'll always make sure I'll use a good ball bearing swivel with it, just because I don't use them a lot anymore, just because all the line twists you can get with it. But again, if you're just shore casting from shore, you have a good swivel on it, you should be all right, and you can just untwist your line when you get it home, re-soak that reel in some hot water when you're done. And that'll help relax the fibers again. But that's one I really like is spinners. Another one, if you're into a slower presentation, can't beat under a bobber using some live bait.
Yep.
You can use worm, you can use minnows, you can use leeches. Leeches are, I personally haven't used leeches. I really want to though, because they're like rubber. In fact, Jesse, I think you're fishing with your nephew, right? And you have an experience. I know for many times when you fished with younger ones, you fish with worms and it feels like you can't even get a cast out yourself before they've had a sunfish peck off the worm and they ask you, hey, I need you to put another worm on.
Yep, all day long. So you buy leeches and they're rubbery, like Andrew said. You hook them, you can catch at least a dozen fish on each one. And unlike a worm, they'll just peck it off. So it is a bit of a time saver. One thing you have to keep in mind though, leeches do not like cold water. So when it's late fall, not the best option to use, because they kind of just ball up on the hook and they don't they don't wiggle around as freely as they do in the summer. So keep that in mind. But minnows are great. Like, I mean,
minnows would be my optimum fall live bait.
We get asked a lot, and we should do a podcast on this eventually about using live bait. We don't use a lot of live bait ourselves anymore. We grew up using a lot. I think it's just because we like to challenge ourselves as anglers, so that it kind of rules out, generally speaking, live bait. I'm not against using it. If I was, walleye fishing or fishing for food, I kind of have this thing where I don't like killing something for catch and release fishing. So I know it's a worm or it's a minnow, but it just feels weird to me to kill a minnow, to kill a living thing, to catch something, to throw it back. That makes no sense to me. But if I'm going walleye fishing or perch fishing on Lake Simcoe and I'm keeping fish, and I'll use live bait, and I don't really have any feelings about that. But for us, we just like to challenge ourselves and use lures. But if you were to ask me, is live bait more effective in the cold? It absolutely is, generally speaking. So don't feel for a second that you can't use live bait. It is super effective. It's just sometimes anglers like me and Andrew, we get dumb and we are like, oh no, I'm just going to use lures. And we would literally not catch any fish. If we had brought minnows, we probably would have caught something. So sometimes you kick yourself for not bringing, live bait. So don't be afraid to use it. I've caught a lot of fish over the years on live bait, like a ton. And again, like you said, you never know what you're going to catch. You put a minnow out, anything swims by and eat that. Yeah. Minnows are like potato chips. Like fish just see them like, mine, So yeah. Absolutely. And a lot of the tackle shops carry minnows pretty much year round now. So just, it's more annoying to bring live bait too. Say you're shore fishing and you have to take a bus somewhere and you're going to go and you have to walk a long distance. Here you are carrying a big sloshing pail of minnows or a thing of minnows. It's like, got to keep these things alive. Anyway.
Going into some of the gear that is going to help you keep fishing on the water or on the water's edge, hopefully, is what you're wearing. Clothing in the fall, in any of the colder temperatures, is of vital importance. In the summertime, if you want to fish and nothing but your little banana hammock, go for it. That's up to you.
Please
don't do it around me, but that's up to you, right? But in the summer, you're not going to get hyperthermia. You're not going to be uncomfortable on a plus 30 day because, I'm wearing, not enough clothes, and that means no, it doesn't matter. In the fall or the early spring, but we're talking about fall right now, the temperatures get deceptively cold really quick, and you can be like, shorts, t-shirt is no problem. Look outside in the afternoon, like, this is great. I worked all day, I work outside, and I wore shorts and t-shirt all day. It's perfect. You go fishing, you stop moving, you stop your activity that you were doing at work, and now you're standing and the sun's dipping down, you're fishing that beautiful like sunset hour, and all of a sudden the temperature drops like 10 degrees and there's a slight breeze, and that breeze is now frigid. Like, it can get super uncomfortable super fast.
Well, we were just camping last weekend, and it was one of those days where it was hot. Like, it was like 20 degrees, and in the fall that's pretty hot, and we were sweating, we were taking off layers, and as soon as the sun went down, it instantly just got frigid. I'm like, oh, it's freezing. We were like shivering.
We were seeing our breath.
Yeah. So it happens fast. So you definitely need to dress properly.
Yeah. And staying dry is very important. So besides just having good layers, like wool, like merino wool is very nice, but wool is very good for keeping you cool when you want to be cool and keeping you warm when you want to be warm. It's a very good insulator. So having some good layers you can take on and off, even shirts, that's very important. But again, like flannel, I love flannel shirts. Love them for the fall. I have big flannel coats as well. I put on top of them, hoodies. But the thing is, those aren't waterproof. So if you start to get a sprinkling of rain, or you're holding, salmon or trout and you're catching them and you're reaching down into the water and your arms are getting wet, it can be very uncomfortable, and that will stay wet for the rest of the day.
Yeah, it's not like
I know
summer
from experience.
In the summer you get your sleeve, wet, and then 10 minutes later it's dry. And then the winter or the fall, it's like it's going to be wet the whole day. Yeah,
which is having things like a good rain suit, like we talked about before. It seems like every episode recently we talk about the importance of a good rain suit. That's because it's very important.
I think too, that's because it also has rained a lot this year. Like, I was just talking, so I have this little highlight on our Instagram stories of all the camping trips we took this year, and that it's rained every single trip at least once.
Mm-hmm.
Without any nice trips, every single one has been rained on. And the trip we just went on, the Muskie trip, same thing. We had one day out on the water, the next day, huge storm. Not just like a little sprinkling around. I'm talking like thunder and lightning, 45K gusts. Bad. So a rain suit this year for me has been worth its weight in gold.
And if you are fishing from shore, if you have access to it, a nice pair of waders are fantastic because two reasons. One, it's like rubber boots except less risk of getting a soaker, like stepping in just a couple inches too deep if you're on shore, or kind of slipping in a little bit. Another benefit to it though is that can extend your range on how much shoreline you have access to, because you may be able to wade in a couple feet and then walk another 100 feet down the shore, but there's a lot of overhanging trees there. But if you have waders, you can walk along that shore just in the water a bit and keep fishing. So it can open up a lot more areas perhaps to you as well.
Yep.
But at least having, some good waterproof boots is very essential, because again, a soaker is going to ruin your day for sure.
Yep.
I want to mention a couple other things that we'd bring, other gear kind of stuff that you'd recommend people bring for fall fishing, Jesse.
So like I mentioned before, a backpack is a big deal. So fishing tackle boxes have come a long way. I noticed that you can actually buy a lot of fishing tackle boxes that are backpacks, and they have tray slots that the trays slide in. Those are fancy. Like if you have one of those, you got it made. But a regular backpack, which you probably already own, is great because you could just throw a bunch of stuff in it. Like I said, you throw one or two tackle trays, 3,600, 3,700 trays, fill it with a bunch of lures. You don't need much. A few swim baits, some jerk baits, spinners, and spoons. That's all you need. Throw that in the backpack. As you walk, you'll just hear the tackle jiggle every time you walk. That's great. That's a great noise. Again, I like to bring a flask, not a flask. What do you call it? A thermos. You can bring a flask too, but I wouldn't recommend it. But I like to bring a thermos full of coffee, some hot coffee, because so many days we are out there fishing and it is frigidly cold, right? And one of the best things to have if you like coffee or any drink is a hot drink. It just really warms you up. It's fantastic. Another thing that we really like to have is headlamps. Now, we mentioned this last week on the podcast that it does get very dark very quickly now. It gets dark. The last time we were out fishing, it seemed like it was like 6:30 and it was already dark out, which is absolutely terrible. But as you're fishing, it's great to have a headlamp, because even like I'm getting a little bit older, but to be able to tie knots or switch lures or find lures in your tackle box, or find anything like open your coffee, do anything like that. If you have a headlamp, it's so good, especially when you're unhooking fish as well. You can fish kind of until it gets dark and then actually find your way back to your vehicle or where you have to go. Another thing that is really essential that you definitely need when you're shore casting is polarized sunglasses. Now, a lot of times when you're shore fishing, again, sometimes you have a lot of area to fish. So when you have polarized sunglasses, you will be able to see through the water way better than if you didn't have them. And it'll allow you to see exactly what you're fishing. So oftentimes, I think back to the time I was fishing with my dad once, and he had never worn polarized sunglasses before in his life. And he was fishing this hole in this creek, and I said to him, like, "Oh, are there any fish there?" And he's like, "Yeah, there is some fish there." And I was like, "No, I don't see any fish." And he's like, you can't tell." And I was like, "Here, put on these sunglasses." So he put them on. And he's like, "Wow, I can see right to the bottom of the pool." I'm like, "Yeah, there's no fish there, right?" So having polarized sunglasses really can help you even when you're shore casting. It's not just when you're in a boat. It's anytime you're fishing. You'll be able to see into the water, and you'll be able to see weeds. You'll be able to see rocks. You'll be able to see fish, which are fantastic. And again, not super expensive now. You can pick up a pair for not that much money. So that's another thing too.
Well, I wanted to, there's a couple things we are running a bit long on this episode. Now, I know everyone's like, that's fine. Episodes are good. We like the information. But I was just looking, some of these things we could probably do another whole episode on to cover effectively for you. So we're going to do some of that later. We're going to get into some of those spots of, how to improve, like pinpointing locations on locations. We gave you some ideas to look for, but, what are the fish movements, stuff like that in the fall. We're going to cover that in another podcast for you. But I do want to talk about some of our experiences. because in the fall can be one of those times, like I said, where you could have nothing, or you could have one of like the best stories of your life come out of it. And I find the fall is more catered to that kind of ratio than any other time of the year. I know for me, one of my, like Jesse and I, we were discussing as to the stories we want to tell are going to be shore fishing in the fall. And we fish a lot out of the boat. So I was like, what did I do for shore fishing in the fall last? What was the last like good story I got from it? And it has to be, I'm sure some of had predicted, it was me at the cottage when I was younger. Again, I used to fish there a lot. So a lot of my stories come from that area. I apologize, but I don't. Up there, speaking of using live bait as well, what I would do is I would actually catch minnows on using like number 16 trout hooks and stuff. And then I would catch minnows using like little slivers of worm I'd put on the hook, catch a minnow, put them in a bucket, and use those minnows and go and catch, my bass, my pike, whatever I wanted to catch in the fall. And it's happened to me on more than one occasion, but the first time it happened, I think I was about 13, maybe 13, 14 years old. I was standing on the dock, and all I do is, because it's so light, I can't cast it. I don't even fish under a bobber. I just have this little like wispy braid coming down and a little tiny hook and a sliver of worm, and I just kind of like flick my rod out into the water, and I just watch to see that worm disappear. Set the hook and just pop this little minnow up. I'm fishing, and all of a sudden I have a little like dust shot above it too, a little weight, just so it doesn't, sinks down slightly better with nothing on the hook. But it sinks down, and all of a sudden, normally you just kind of see the worm or the tip of the hook, and you have to wait for the whole hook to enter into the minnow's mouth before you can kind of catch it. The whole thing just disappeared. I'm like, what? I should see it. What happened to this? So I just kind of pull up because I thought maybe it's hidden behind a weed. And all of a sudden my line just shoots underneath the dock that I'm standing on. And I was not expecting this, because normally you just lift the rod up and there's something that weighs like a half ounce on the edge of your line. Like that's what I'm catching. And I caught like a 2.5 pound smallmouth that came up and ate the smallest bit of worm I've ever put on a hook. And I think that may be why I'm obsessed with finesse fishing. But those are the things, like in the fall.
That's Andrew's origin story.
That was before BFS was invented. I was doing it before it was cool. But to have that, like, that was one of those things, like, as a kid, that was one of my biggest bass at the time. Caught on the smallest bait possible. And it's just like, it blew my mind why it would ever come up to it. But that was one of the coolest things. In fact, when I lifted it out of the water, I didn't know any better at the time. I was younger, and I just kind of like raised, I high sticked the rod, right? And the rod didn't break. But with such a small hook, it just bent out on that fish and started flopping on the dock. And my cousin just dive bombed and gave it a big bear hug so it wouldn't fall in the water. But that was one of the first times I caught like a substantial fish in the fall. And it's weird that it was, again, technically it was live bait. Maybe not, because the worm I guarantee that small of a worm slice is dead. That can't just regrow into another worm. But what about you, Jesse? What's a memorable fishing experience that you had?
Well, this doesn't involve fishing for minnows. So I used to fish one of my local. Yeah. Oh, even as a small child, I didn't like wasting my time. But just kidding. So I was fishing one of the local marinas near my house, and I was young, not as young as Andrew, probably like 15 years old. And it wasn't super late in the season, but salmon run was definitely done. And I was one of those guys that, like, after school, I would ride my bike down to the marina, and I would just, I'd fish until it got dark, and I'd go home almost every day, even if I didn't catch anything. But all I had was my salmon rod with a J13 tied onto it. And I was like, oh, you never know, there might be another salmon swimming around. And the marinas are kind of those places where you never know what you're going to catch. Like in this particular one, I've caught 9-pound walleye, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, Chinook salmon, northern pike, sheephead, catfish, like it doesn't matter. Like, you never know what you're going to catch. So I was down there and I was just casting. Some of the guys were like, bottom bouncing for steelhead already. I think it was like late October. And I whip out my J13. I'm reeling it in. And all of a sudden, boom, crush this fish, starts head shaking. And I'm like, okay, I think it's a salmon because it was fighting pretty good. It came up and I fought it, and some guy scooped it in a net for me. And it was, at the time, my biggest northern pike. It was a big, I don't even know if we measured it. I would estimate now probably 32, 33 inches. It was the biggest one at the time that I ever caught. It wasn't a giant by any means, but it was a big fish. And I was so stoked because I had not had a lot of experience catching decent, like mostly it would be like hammer handles, right? Like, 24-inch northerns. So it was one of the biggest pike I'd ever caught at that point. And I was like, this is amazing. And like we were talking about before, these big pike, if you fish that area in the summer, you never catch pike that big. But in the fall, those fish come shallow. There is actually a little weed bed there that attracts some minnows. And it was sitting right there, and I cast over and I smashed it. So definitely fishing in the fall, you're going to open up opportunities of fish coming in that would never normally be there in the summer when you might normally fish. It may be cold, it may be uncomfortable outside, but you can catch fish that you'd never have an opportunity at if you tried in the comfortable time of the year. So that's a great example of some of the success that you can have.
And
so I actually have,
I was going to say, I think we have some people from our listeners too. We asked people to write in and share some of their stories and perhaps tips for fall fishing as well that they've experienced. And this is all kind of just to get you excited. If we didn't do a good enough job so far in this episode to encourage you to go fall fishing, then don't take it from us. Take it from these other people too about fall fishing is cool.
Yeah. So I put up a story and I said, give us a short but interesting story about a fall fishing adventure that you had. So all of these stories are literally one sentence because it has to be short. So Jeremy says this. He says his best friend caught a brand new over $300 Abu Garcia combo shore fishing with me last weekend. So that's a great shore fishing catch. Actually, it's funny. It's not shore fishing related, but we were fishing a few weeks ago with our buddy Ryan, muskie fishing, and he snagged and brought up a whole spinning combo off the bottom of the lake. And it was
down there for a while.
Yeah. So I have caught some random stuff fishing. A lot of the piers and stuff, oftentimes big fish will pull people's rods in when they're not paying attention. So it definitely is a big possibility catching a full fishing rod and reel. So you never know what you're going to catch.
Before too.
That could be the catch of the day.
I think I've caught two. I've caught three in my life. One was a nice fishing rod we talked about before, but I've caught two other spinning combos in the past.
So our buddy Neil from Zimbabwe. Remember we talked about Neil from Zimbabwe? So he actually, this is probably the more interesting one. No offense to everyone else. You're not going to beat this. Just because he's from Zimbabwe. So he says, his shore fishing adventure, he says, crocodiles in Africa, when you walk around and they simply are not visible until it's too late.
That's terrifying. The amount of times I've seen videos of just like, it's like, oh, look at this nice algae covered water. And then like a chicken slaps onto it and this giant behemoth leviathan just shoots out of the water. Like, that's terrifying.
Yeah. We deal with crackheads, they deal with crocodile heads.
Crockheads.
So, crockheads. So, speaking of Ryan actually messaged us and he said that he was fishing near a local dam not too long ago and a great blue heron was following me on the shoreline. You know why?
Why?
Because they like eating delicious treats and Ryan's a cutie. Just kidding. Ryan's like, why?
Ryan's never going fishing with us again.
So another guy says he had the cops show up for a wellness check after my buddy fell and filled his waders in the river. So, I mean, it's good that the cops are doing some good and checking, see if you're all soaked. That's cool. It's happened. It happens. Craig says this. He says, my brother once left a baited rod out that got taken out into the lake by a fish. And he says, later got it. I was going to say, maybe that's the rod that guy caught, but no, he got it back. So that would be another tip too. If you are fishing live bait or something like that, that you're letting your bait stay in the water and you're not paying attention to your rod, make sure you have your bail open or a bait alarm or something.
Or like tether your
Because a
rod
big
to
fish
a
in the
rail or
fall-
something.
Yeah. They'll pull your, I've seen it so many times at the harbor or off
Mhm.
the pier when guys will be fishing like eggs off the bottom, and a salmon comes and grabs it and just swims, and the rod just whoop, down the water. You'll never see that again. 30 feet down. So anyway, there's one more. This guy named Jesse says, one time a swan attacked me and I ran like heck to get away.
I've
So,
experienced that too.
I've got attacked by swans too. So my advice would be, you think cobra chickens are bad, like Canadian geese? Swans are evil.
Mhm.
Like they're literally evil.
They
If you see
hurt
a
a
swan
lot
and you're
more.
shore fishing, run away in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
If they start hissing at you,
I
run.
find
Don't challenge
geese, they'll beat you with their wings and it'll leave bruises. Swans will like bite you, and they like their bites hurt. And they'll also beat you with their wings, and they're even larger. So, but yeah, those are some good stories. So again, if you want to go fishing in the fall, if you want to worry about crocodiles, if you're out in other countries, or if you want to be chased by swans, or if you want to lose your rod in the lake, fall fishing is where it's at. Also, if you want to
them.
catch,
It's the right
if
thing
you
to
want
do.
to catch possibly your PB fish, these fish are feeding up. They're in areas you can access. A couple of reminders we want to talk about just at the very end is in the fall, for any shore casters, shore fishermen, or if you're in a boat, whatever, be careful not to always respect the environment. So clean up after yourselves. If you're fishing, like Jesse said, bring a coffee. That's great. Take the cup back with you. Something that can be tempting, and you may see a lot out there, but try not to contribute to it. Another reminder, again, Jesse did allude to it, or did mention it before. Look at the fishing regulations. Make sure that an area of a creek especially, or because those are often have many different dividers on them in the regulations, make sure that you are allowed to fish in those areas, but also certain lakes and whatnot, and depending on the species, make sure you update on that. And in the fall, another thing for catching and release, one benefit is cold water is actually better for the fish. They have a higher chance of survival in colder temperatures. The downside is we often don't like holding our hands in the water, letting the fish revive when our hands are freezing off. But having safe handling procedures, having that fish out of the water as little as possible, means that it'll have a less time of you having to hold onto it and revive it in that frigid water. So just making sure you're following that, it'll just lead everyone to be able to enjoy our time fall fishing. Thanks again to all our Patreon members. All your help that you supply to the account, to the show with your monthly subscription. That's fantastic. So thanks again for everyone doing that. Thanks again to all of our listeners for listening every week, downloading the episodes. And if you have a chance, tell someone about tell someone about the show. Let them know.
Yeah, because we can't afford advertising. So if you advertise for us, that would be amazing. Actually, I know we've gone a little bit overtime in this episode, but I have a few reviews to read.
That's awesome. Absolutely.
If you don't mind.
I love
I always say I'm going to read reviews, and it's hard to remember. So here is one. This is from Chris Hill, who we know. He's a super nice guy. He says 5 stars.
No.
Awesome. Imagine it was like Chris Hill. He says 1 star. Just kidding. So he says, this is probably the best fishing podcast I've ever heard. Blush. Just kidding. Mostly because the hosts are pretty much the same age as me and is very relatable to my own fishing experience. Many other podcast shows seem to get boring. This podcast has me very interested, and I can rewatch again and again. They're very knowledgeable anglers. Even a pro Bassmaster elite angler could learn something from this podcast. Great job, guys. Well, I don't know about that, but thanks, Chris. We
High
appreciate
words
it.
of praise, but what bass angler guys are you watching?
The guy that comes 120th out of 122nd boats. Yeah. The next podcast is from some random name I can't pronounce. He says, wow, Average Ontario Anglers is the best fishing podcast out there. From people just like me getting into angling to the super experienced, AOA has something for everyone. I have learned so much. Highly recommended. That's awesome. And I would just like to mention on our podcast analytics, it compiles all the ratings from all the different streaming services. Because we're on Spotify, we're on Apple, but we're also on 12 other smaller streaming services as well. This podcast, we have 80 episodes now, or I think 82, something like that. And we have almost 500 5-star reviews. So that is absolutely fantastic. If you haven't given us a review yet, we're kind of in a review war, like with some of the other local Ontario podcasts. I mean, we're killing most of them, but we want to have the most reviews possible. So if you haven't given us a review, yes, give us a review. We would really appreciate it. So those are some of the reviews we had. And again, if you do write a really hilarious review, we 100% will read it. Just make it appropriate, people. Anyway.
You know how we talk in the podcast, just match that. But yeah, thanks again for everyone who has left reviews as well. To finish off our episode this week, we have, as tradition states, the quote of the week. And to handle that is Jesse with the large swim bait in his hand.
Hear this? That's a swim bait. Here's my quote of the week. You don't have to be poor to fish from the shore.